Kia ora everyone. I think my presentation has been put on at the end of the day because it's conceptually the easiest to understand. And also my previous 5 speakers have done the hard work in explaining the Wau-Kiwi cohort very thoroughly. I also want to thank the Ministry of Health very much for funding this additional work. I also think it shows another reason why cohort studies are so valuable, because you can link them to so many other things, particularly with the very linkable data we have in New Zealand. And I want to really thank Tim Wood for the analysis for this. So I'm just going to run through the obvious areas why the aims, methods, results, and then what it all means. So we know disease surveillance is important for guiding effective public health management of infectious disease threats. And of course, we would love the data to be accurate, valid, representative, and all the other things, timely and so on. And one of the threats that, of course, is under ascertainment or under detection. And really, this is inevitable with all data. It's never 100% sensitive, and often it doesn't matter very much, particularly if you can measure the level of under ascertainment. There's one situation where it does really matter, and that is when you have case-based responses, and this is where you have to respond to every single case. And that is actually the situation for most notifiable diseases. You want to know every event. Also, remember, during the elimination phase, every case mattered. But once you move beyond that, of course, it doesn't matter anymore, or very rarely does it matter. Then you're more concerned with the policy-based surveillance. And that's where you are concerned about ascertainment or detection bias. And this is where there's systematic failure to represent all of the categories of cases. And this may be influenced by problems of diagnosis or problems of reporting. And so that does matter if you're trying to inform your policy or evaluation. So if you think about under ascertainment, it has these 2 components. There's under diagnosis and under reporting. So under diagnosis is all those things about the system may not be very accessible, or may not be accessed very well. There may be unrecognised or asymptomatic cases, or they may be untested. All the tests, of course, have limitations. So all of that goes into the undiagnosed component. What I'm talking about is the second component, which is the unreported cases. And I'm focusing just on one thing, this outcome measure, which is this curve, of course, we got very interested in at different points. And these are the National Repository of COVID-19 case data, which are predominantly self-reported rat test results. And if you think about it, this is really a huge change in our way of doing surveillance, where you're getting the whole public. This is citizen science in action, where the public tests themselves, they recognise they've got symptoms, they test themselves maybe several times, and then they report the results. It's a huge shift in our way of doing surveillance. And so it is important to study this. And so I'm really focusing on this curve here, or series of waves. And the aims really are to measure the reported or unreported component of case ascertainment, measure how it's changed over time, and measure how it varies by socio-demographic group, and say, well, does it really matter? What does it mean? So obviously, the nice way of measuring case ascertainment is if you've got multiple data sources, or at least 2 is what you need, you can link together. And that's, again, the great thing about the fact that we've got the NHI that can link the Wau-Kiwi cohort to those people who wound up in the National Repository. And then we've got, obviously, high levels of testing the Wau-Kiwi cohort. It won't be perfect, but it's the nearest thing we've got to, I don't like the term gold standard, but you could say a reference standard for this infection. And of course the ECLAIR database, which has all of the self-reported data sitting there, mainly obviously RAT results that are entered by the public. So one of the first things you can look at is just the curve of the top curve. The darker one is the positive results in the Wau-Kiwi cohort itself. And the other curve below that is those that actually wound up in the National Repository. And that's because of linked data, you could follow up and see if they appeared there or not. And not surprisingly, the curve is slightly lower for those that actually got reported. So that's kind of what you expect. But if we reduce this down to something that's easier to look at, in the first wave, about 90%, a bit over 90% wound up in the National Repository. We were very good, or I should say the Well Kiwi cohort members were very good in that first wave. The second wave, they got a little less conscientious, that the reporting had dropped, but overall it's still pretty impressive. Over 80% of those people entered their results. So we can look at this again, that's moving from the temporal trend, and this is now the socio-demographic characteristics. You can look at that reporting by age group. And you can see again, it's not a lot of bias in there, except when you're getting down to really the under fives. And you can see that this reporting system is systematically undercounting young children who get this infection. And again, intuitively, that's perhaps not that surprising. We can look at the gender split. Again, very similar for males and females, slight difference there. One of the things that was interesting, of course, is to look at the ethnicity spread, and you can see that Pacific participants had very high reporting of their results, and somewhat lower for the Asian participants. And again, we're interested in whether there was a deprivation gradient, and there's really nothing very marked there. I mean, it does look like there's a slightly lower reporting in NZ Det quintile 1, 2 there. So what does it all mean? Well, overall I would say that reporting is relatively high. We're losing maybe about 15% of cases who are testing positive and not reporting. It did decrease over time, which again is not that surprising. It was pretty representative of the characteristics of the reporting population, except for lower reporting in younger children. But clearly underreporting is a significant component to under-ascertainment. And if we look at this another way, you can see that by the end of the cohort in October, the cumulative prevalence was about 50% were detected to have had COVID-19 infection, but the reporting prevalence was about 42% if you just multiply that by the fraction who didn't report. And that's actually quite similar to the cumulative prevalence sitting in that national repository. So it does suggest that perhaps this is the major source of under-ascertainment amongst those that had a positive test result. Of course, it's only the one component of under-ascertainment. The other component is those that didn't test themselves, or where the testing had reduced sensitivity. So this is very much, these results have just been produced in the last day, so it does need more analysis, it needs confidence intervals and so on in there. It's still a relatively small sample size, so we can't say that much about some of the subpopulations. We imagine that the Well Kiwi population is not representative of New Zealand. They sound like a very enthusiastic group of people who also supported hugely to participate. So we'd expect them to be perhaps more conscientious, more aware than average. And of course, as I was saying, this does not look at the underdiagnosis component. And one of the things that will be very interesting would be the serological results, and they will come through I think in a few months, won't they? So that can tell us about the other component of under-ascertainment, which is those that were not diagnosed. So again, this is going to be very helpful because we can start to tease out in this really unique form of reporting based on public engagement. What are the biases in that process? So I think that'll be very interesting when we can put all of that together in the future. So I think one of the implications is that, thank goodness, we have composite surveillance in New Zealand. That's a bit of a made-up term to say we've got lots of surveillance sources we can look at to give us a picture of what's going on. Personally, I always find the hospitalisation data very helpful because there's a fairly consistent threshold. No one wants to go to hospital if they're admitted. I think that does tell us what's happening with the epidemic in terms of its progression. The other source which I think is very valuable, of course, is again a big innovation from COVID-19 and the good work of ESR has been the wastewater testing. And again, that's there's a lot of work's gone into trying to work out how we can validate that in relation to the case reporting data. But I think all of this, for me, another big take-home message is why we need an infection prevalence surveillance. And while this is often framed as an infection prevalence survey, why shouldn't it be just ongoing surveillance? And after all, it starts to intersect with Well Kiwi itself and the idea of more intensive sentinel surveillance. And I think from looking at this area for a number of years, and I think a lot of the work that's come out of SHIVERS, it's basically saying we need these intensive, very well managed sentinel sites to tell us what's going on. They're an incredible resource, not only in the short term for telling us what's happening, but also because of that amazing longitudinal quality they have about them, and we're seeing huge benefits from that. So I think why aren't we consolidating our national effort into supporting a relatively small number of very high quality sentinel sites? Because that means that we can use them to validate all of our lower quality population level data. That's my main take-home message. Thanks.